Chapter 71, Patience. Ivil wouldn't admit it so readily, but she was thankful that Aurora had taken some time to go over names and faces before the meeting began. Not that she intended to keep all of those memories. Politicians and the elite didn't rate very high in matters of importance to her. The meeting took place in a smaller room aboard the station. Smaller than the main lobby area, that was. It was still quite spacious. The ceiling wasn't all that terribly high, but it still rose up in the center to allow a ring of lights to be pitched over a large circular table. Around the edge were some benches with handholds for anyone watching the proceedings, as well as a small bar manned by a mechanized bartender with several serving drones parked next to it, each capable of grabbing a drink and silently carrying it across the room to the one who'd ordered it. Ivil walked in on Aurora's right flank, with 26 on the side opposite and Pepper taking up the rear of their little diamond formation. For the moment, all four of them were walking under the comfortable weight of half an Earth gravity. It was a power play. A minor one, but still one that would be obvious to the other participants in the meeting who had to move about with the assistance of a zero-G drone. Each seat around the table had a small plaque before it with the name of the participant and their moon of origin written upon it. The seat immediately to that participant's right was empty, a space for assistants, aides, or trusted counselors. Who did you wish to have sitting by your side? Pepper asked Aurora. Aurora hummed to herself. That's actually a difficult question. Yourself, Miss Mint, are the one best versed in political matters. Evelyn is the most intimidating one here, and 26 would be a lot help in downplaying things and also with the Saturnian contingent. Ah, I'd rather not, 26 said. I've never had to stand in front of a crowd before. That's fair. This wouldn't be a good place to cut your teeth on such social matters, Aurora said. Evelyn? I wouldn't mind, Ivil replied. Though. Let Pepper take the seat. I'd much rather be at the back where I can better observe things. Trust me, I don't need to be in the same room or in the same planetary system as someone to intimidate them. Aurora giggled, but next to her Pepper swallowed hard. With that, Aurora and Pepper moved up to their seats at the table. There was no place of pride, not at a round table, they would all be more or less equal here. The delegate from Styx arrived, parking himself across from Aurora and trading a nod with her. Then Tethys arrived, Hyperion, and Titania. The outer edges were starting to fill a little. While most delegates chose to have one assistant by their side, most also had a few hangers-on who filed out to the outer walls. Umbriel stumbled into the room and then quickly flew to their place while adjusting their suit, and finally Galatea and Callisto. Callisto, Mr. Aida, brought the slob. The representative was 2 people away from Aurora. The slob nonetheless positioned himself at the far end of the room from Ivil instead of at his man's back. Mr. Aida scanned the room, then gave them all a politician's smile. He cleared his throat, the sound loud and clear before he spoke. Greetings, everyone, he said. I'm proud to meet and speak to so many delegates from so many moons across the system. Today, I believe, will be a subtle but momentous day for many. We are gathered here to address our stances on several issues before the more official meeting of the League of Free Moons. Ivil tuned out some of his grandstanding drivel. The gist of it was relatively simple. The League of Free Moons and its apparently very shrewd president wanted to turn a disparate group of small nation-states into something larger, something more potent. In terms of sheer numbers, they might actually have something. The various moons of the system were all far smaller than either of the 2 major powerhouses Earth and Mars, but together their GDP matched or exceeded that of either superpower. Of course, that was, in a word, bullshit. Those numbers included Deimos, Mars' moon, and Luna, Earth's massive moon. Removing those 2 from the equation brought that figure down to something closer to half or maybe 2/3 of either superpower's annual production. That was still nothing to sneeze at. If a 4th inter-system war broke out, then the League of Free Moons might very well be the one who chose who would win in the end. It all hinged on a single large factor, however. The League had their own emperor. Again, however, that was bullshit. The Emperor of Jupiter didn't care about the moon he lived on, and Ivil very much doubted he cared much about any other moon either. She'd met the man. He wasn't the sort of person to concern themselves overly much with such things. He was a self-righteous prick who thought he was better than everyone. He even thought so when she was around. Of course, the man wasn't all bad. She was loath to say it, but she respected the Emperor of Jupiter as a sort of long-distance colleague. They'd never get along, but he did some things in a way that she could approve of. Notably, he was happily married for, she considered the day, about 20 years now. His successful conquest in matters of romance had been one of the original inspirations for her own early dabbles in such matters. If he could be happy with his loving wife, then why couldn't she, the better, hotter Empress, have the same? Mr. Aida eventually finished yapping on, and a round of introductions began, because of course politicians had to wax on and on about themselves. Aurora, at least, kept things light and quick. Her name, the moon she represented, and the buck was passed. It made the next representative hesitate. The discussion, once the introductions were completed, turned towards the topic at hand. What exactly do we know about the interstellar object? The representative of Styx asked. He was directing his attention towards the two representatives from Uranus. This was a bit of a delicate situation. From what Aurora had explained to Ivil the day prior, the interstellar object, the large lump containing several hundred, possibly up to 1,000 inactive cores, was found by a ship that ostensibly belonged to several moons of Jupiter. It was crewed by a mixed group from several Jovian moons and a large number of Saturnian scientists who worked for the League of Free Moons. The object was captured, however, very close to Uranus, and because of its size and the delicate nature of the operation, several Uranian ships had assisted in the operation. In a way, those volunteered ships had yet to be recompensed for the extremely dangerous work they'd undertaken. The delegates from Uranus would be well within their rights to say that they were owed a favor or two, and they had been in the loop about the interstellar object for longer than most members. There were rumors that the object had stayed around Uranus, being shuffled around, for several weeks. We know a fair bit, the Titanian representative said. But it's not us you should be poking at. He turned his attention to the representative from Saturn. Isn't that right? Just because the crew's poking at the thing or ours doesn't mean we know anything, the Hyperion rep said. I mean, we definitely do, but we're not gonna share so easily. We could have used those ourselves, the Uranian said. We know there are enough cores there to take someone right up to a class. Or we could have funded half a dozen powerful B-classers. And then the League would destroy you, Styx said. If only by letting Mars or Earth know. It's just enough cores that either of them might be tempted to try something, and alone, you wouldn't stand a chance. The Uranian sniffed. We wouldn't have. I'm merely pointing out that the Uranian moons have acted honorably when we so easily could have chosen not to. Ivil rolled her eyes at the back of the room. That was more thinly veiled political stupidity. She really had very little patience for it. But Aurora seemed to be in her element, and 26? Was slowly nodding off. Ivil stiffened slightly as 26 tipped over to the side and rested her head on Ivil's arm. Yes, maybe she could leave the politicians to their bickering for now. She was the image of patience and self-control. A Mac, Ivil does fiction. 26 fluttered her eyes open, then yawned. There was a nasty crick in her neck, and she felt a bit of saliva sticking to her cheek, which was weird. She wasn't much of a drooler except when she was sleeping really well. Blinking, she took Inch. A very large, fancy room, and was struck with a painful realization that she had fallen asleep in the middle of a meeting. Fortunately she was off to the side, sitting on one of those benches along the outer wall, far from the action and arguments. Unfortunately, she was still leaning to the side, her face pressed up against something warm and roughened. She sat up straight and wiped her face clean, while hoping beyond hope that she hadn't drooled too hard. Awake? Evelyn asked. 26 nodded. I'm sorry, she mumbled. Evelyn smiled, then casually waved 26's concern away. It's fine. Even tugboats need to be moored at times, right? Whatever blush had been fading returned, and 26 found herself glaring at Evelyn for all she was worth. "Stop that," she said. It sounded whiny and weak, even to her. The tugboat metaphors had gone too far. Too far. Yes, they were funny, in a sort of embarrassing way, and yes, she liked it when Evelyn thought of her that way, but still, it was humiliating. Worse, it was a humiliation of her own making. She should have never told Evelyn that she sometimes thought that way. "Did you sleep well?" Evelyn asked. 26 swallowed. At least the teasing had stopped. For now. It wasn't the right place for it anyway. "Yeah, I guess," she said. She did feel really refreshed, though she put a hand up against her neck and twisted her head around a few times. Back on the first station she could remember living in, her bunk had been sized for a normal, earthly human. She'd quickly grown too big for it, and that led to years of sleeping crooked. "Want me to fix your neck?" Evelyn asked. "I've got deft fingers." 26 felt herself stilling for a moment, then shook her head. "It's fine," she said while trying her best not to squeak. She even succeeded for once, but now she needed a distraction. The politicians were boring. Someone was talking on, and even while trying to catch on to some context clues to know what was happening, 26 found herself unable and unwilling to actually listen. If it was Aurora talking, then maybe. That woman had a voice on her. All smooth and dulcet with this little upper-class Martian accent that sounded very posh. It reminded 26 of the automated warning voice on some of the nicer equipment she'd used. She'd have to ask Aurora to record a few lines sometimes. "Hull breach detected." Or maybe a sultry, fire suppression system activated. "What are you doing?" 26 asked Evelyn. The taller, older, prettier, frankly mostly just better woman was sitting on the same bench as 26, but she somehow managed to make it look like this was a throne. She had a tablet hovering before her. One of those little personal computer sorts that she'd seen Pepper and Evelyn carrying around. "I'm writing," Evelyn said with a gentle smile. "I've discovered that I'm not very talented at it, and none of my cores assist me, so it's an interesting puzzle." "Oh?" 26 asked. "What sort of things do you write?" It was interesting, seeing Evelyn have such a normal hobby. It wasn't as interesting a hobby as, say, CAD sculpting or 3D printing, but it was still kinda neat. "Did you want to read?" Evelyn asked. She sounded surprisingly shy in that moment, and 26 realized that she had never heard Evelyn shy before now. It was cute, but it also didn't suit her at all. Evelyn was made for, like, scaring captains and threatening mean dock workers. Not being a wilting wallflower. Evelyn and being vulnerable fit together like a Martian nut on an Earth-made bolt. "Here," Evelyn said after scrolling to the top of a long text document. 26 took the tablet and blinked a few more times to clear her vision. Then she started reading. Chapter 1. That was an auspicious start, she supposed. She was never really one for fiction reading. Mostly 26 read manuals and sometimes articles. She did do a fair bit of reading, it was just not usually. Sit down and read, reading. She refocused. This was important to Evelyn, she ought to pay attention. "Hi, my name is Emma Olivia Isabella Brown. That's how I got my name. I have brown hair with nothing special about it, beige skin, brown eyes that look like pebbles, and I look like an average person. And, if you don't know what that looks like, imagine a person. I'm not related to any celebrities, politicians, or empresses or emperors, but I wish I was because I think they're pretty cool. I am a regular human, and my teeth are regular and white. I have average skin. I am also a student who goes to a normal school called School 1 in the Martian suburban domes. I'm in the 11th grade. I'm 16, and I'm normal, in case you couldn't tell. I wear normal clothes that I buy at Mars Mart. For example, today I'm wearing a plain white t-shirt and jeans and white sneakers. I was wearing no makeup. I was walking outside of School 1. It was raining time in the dome, so rain was coming down from above. No one stared at me. I waved at them. "Hey, Emma!" shouted a voice. I looked up. It was Aurora Sterlingworth. "What's up, Aurora?" I asked. "Nothing," she said shyly. "But then I heard my friends call me and I had to go away." 26 blinked, then carefully forced herself to reread everything on the page. "Is this the entire chapter?" she asked. "There are more chapters below," Evelyn said. "If you scroll." "Oh, yeah, would you look at that? There's more." So, what do you think?" 26 said. She looked at the tablet again, hoping that maybe it would glitch and suddenly some other text would appear. It didn't. "So, the Aurora here is, our Aurora?" "It's a bit of a self-insert," Evelyn said. 26 nodded slowly. "Okay. And what kind of story is this supposed to be?" "Slice of life romance," Evelyn said. "You show up in chapter 3. "Ah," 26 said intelligently. "What's it called?" "My Mortal." "That's a nice title," 26 said. "So, romance? I usually write action, but it grows tiresome. Page after page of details for each actor's actions and reactions." She shook her head. "A single small fight can take me weeks." "Weeks," 26 repeated. She shook her head. She didn't really have anything to say, but she needed some time to think. It was like holding a leak closed with her thumb while trying to remember which switch she had to flick to bypass it. She had not been prepared for this situation. In fact, it was kind of ruining her entirely outlook on Evelyn in general, because, well, Evelyn was the tall sexy lady who was strong and knowledgeable and sexy. She really was like one of those Martian super dreadnoughts, the way she so easily commanded attention and was such a huge threat no matter where she went. 26 could probably figure out what to do if the super dreadnought had a heating issue, or if its guns needed reloading, but her mental catalog was entirely empty of instructions for the super dreadnought writing bad fiction in its spare time. "It's very nice," she settled on. The same words her own mom had used on her when she was a kid drawing her first wiring schematic. Evelyn's reaction was the same as a young 26's. She beamed, bright and proud. "Thank you. Do you think I should display my work?" No. I mean, think about it this way. Art is like." She swallowed and racked her brain for a metaphor that had nothing to do with ships or engineering. It was surprisingly difficult. "Art, good art, is like those private moments you have with your family between stations. When you're all huddled together and hoping that your shuttle doesn't break halfway to its destination. It's something private, right? And I think it's much nicer when it's very private and no one sees it. I suppose." "I know little about art," Evelyn admitted. "Yeah, I didn't think so," 26 said, then she clamped her mouth shut because that could be easily misinterpreted. Fortunately, a distraction was at hand. The conference was ending, and some of the political sorts were standing, including Aurora. It looked like she was saved. 26 never thought she'd be thankful for political interference, but here she was. Anything to stop her from having to read Chapter 2. Chapter 72, Memorable. Ivil looked up as Aurora crossed the room and came to stand nearby. The woman stretched, hands on her hips and head tilting back as she let her spine crack. It made her blouse slip out of her pants, and Ivil caught a faint glimpse of Aurora's stomach before her stretch ended. "That was painful," she said. "Was it?" Ivil asked. The meeting had gone on for a solid 6 hours, with no real breaks. Some delegates had stood to use the facilities, but for the most part the meeting had gone on without a real pause. "It was," Aurora said as she relaxed on the spot. It seemed to Ivil as though she was allowing herself to be far less formal than usual. Perhaps it was a natural response to having to sit straight and keep her mind in the game for so long. "I legitimately can't wait to be back in our rooms. This station had better have showers. I didn't inspect the washroom, but I'm certain there's something like that," Ivil said. She liked this more relaxed, less reverent version of Aurora. The woman was very attractive when she was her normal noble self, but that only made this more casual Aurora all the more interesting. "Is she sleeping?" Aurora asked with a small gesture to Ivil's side. Ivil looked down and to the side. 26's head was leaning up against her arm. Her mouth was slack, and there was a faint line of glistening drool running from the edge of her lips down to her chin. "She's been sleeping from almost the start," Ivil said. "Though she did move a few times. Did you know she talks in her sleep?" "Does she?" Aurora asked as she raised a hand to hide a smile. "What sort of things does she say?" "Nothing easy to parse, I'm afraid. I think she was talking about not wanting to read. She cried a little at some point and almost came awake when I started to brush her hair. Something about not wanting to tell Evelyn that she's bad?" Ivil shrugged. "Dreams can be a little strange," Aurora said with a smile. "I suppose we have been through a great deal of stress lately. The sleep is good for her. Do you want to wake her up? I should go over what I've learned today with you and Pepper." "It's fine," Ivil said. "We can let her sleep. I'll carry her over." Ivil gently moved to the side while letting go of her artificial gravity around 26. The girl floated slightly, now entirely weightless, until Ivil shifted and hooked her arms behind 26's back and under her legs. She rose, carrying 26. "A princess carry?" Aurora asked. "Would it be more appropriate for me to carry you this way?" Ivil asked. "Princess of Phobos." Aurora's cheeks darkened prettily and she shook her head. Let's just get back to the rooms. I've made a mess of my dress and I don't want to be seen this way." Those seats were surprisingly comfortable, but I swear my entire back is covered in sweat. It's quite gross. "Will Pepper be accompanying us?" Ivil asked. She glanced across the room where Pepper and a few other aides were gathered next to a few hastily set up computers and a single printer which seemed to be broken at the moment. "She's collecting the minutes," Aurora said. "As a hard copy, of all things. It might be useful later. I have the digital version in the meantime. We can wait for her, if you want." "No, it's fine. I'm certain she can take care of herself," Ivil said. She adjusted her hold on 26 slightly. She was keenly aware of the young woman's weight in her arms, and her warmth. Aurora nodded along, and soon started to lead her back towards their rooms. "We'll be staying at the station for another 10 or so hours," Aurora said. "I need rest, and I imagine Pepper does as well. Then we'll be heading back to Driftwood with Miss Pixie guarding us. Our shuttle for the departure will be arriving in about 10 hours as well." "That sounds good to me," Ivil said. "So, how did the meeting go? You were there, weren't you?" Aurora asked. "I was. And I can recite any part of it from memory, but that doesn't mean that I have full contextual knowledge to let me know if things went well or not." "That's fair, actually," Aurora said. "Also, the entire thing from memory?" "I have a very good memory when I care about something," Ivil said. "For example, the memory of seeing that slip of Aurora's stomach was going to be seared into her mind until the sun winked out." "I see," Aurora said. She didn't, but Ivil didn't think it wise to correct her. They made it to their rooms, and Ivil finally looked down at 26. 26 was staring back with wide eyes, a hand close to her mouth as she was cradled in Ivil's arms. "Oh, you're awake," Ivil said. 26 nodded slowly. You can put me down," she said. Ivil considered it. She liked carrying 26 like this. "No," she decided. "I don't want to." "Okay," 26 said. Though, in reality it was more of a squeak. 26 seemed wide awake now. "So, I'll just stay here? Did you know that Imperial Star Dreadnoughts carry ships with them? They are supercarriers. That includes several smaller frigates, but also a complement of tugboats." "Oh," 26 said. Then she looked away from Ivil, her hair shifting into place to almost hide her blush. Ivil liked it when she made the women she was interested in blush. It made something inside of her very warm. "Would you rather I put you to bed, if you're still sleepy?" 26 shook her head and didn't seem ready to comment further. Aurora was looking at them both with a raised eyebrow. Today's meeting went very well," she said. "The Uranians were belligerent as expected, and Titan's delegate is full of himself, but we have something of a tentative agreement." "I heard that," Ivil said. The member moons of the League are going to split the cores evenly? Yes. At least, all of us here have agreed to that. Some moons don't want their share of cores. The Saturnian moons, Ivil said with a nod. She could recall the two delegates being somewhat disinterested in their own share. They never explained why they have a lack of interest. It's because of the nature of Saturn, Aurora said. Oh, 26 replied. I think I know this one. Saturn doesn't have government? I think we mentioned it already. What we do have is super loose, and we kinda mostly don't care. It's all families, clans, and smaller corporations that serve around Saturn and act as middlemen between us and the rest of the big core in the system. That would explain it, Aurora said. She walked over to the fridge and tugged it open, pulled out a glass bottle, then drank from it openly. They won't be able to share the cores evenly across their constituents. Whereas most moons have something like a militia, or at least a more central government. What would Phobos do with its share? Ivil asked. From what I can tell, it would be less than 100 cores in all, Aurora said. So they'd be divided across shareholders. Basically, the noble families would get a share each. With the number of noble families we have, it wouldn't be a number of cores to impress anyone on the wider stage. It might give Phobos a few more C-classers, or a larger number of D-classers. In either case, that would be somewhat impressive, especially to Mars, who keeps a tight grip on any core that. Ivil paused as she watched Aurora place the now empty water bottle onto a table. She shifted her shoulders and removed her jacket, revealing a sweat-stained blouse beneath that clung to her, the sheer material hinting at a lot. Then Aurora removed her blouse. Ivil wondered why Aurora wore lingerie today. Was it what she wore all the time? 26 was craning her neck so hard that there was a real risk that she'd hurt herself. The door opened, and Pepper walked in before stopping in her tracks. She stared at Ivil and 26, then over to Aurora, who still had her back turned to the rest of them and who was casually riffling through her luggage. Should I return? She asked. No, but you should close the door, Ivil replied. Aurora was just filling us in on the results of the conference. I see, Pepper said. Yes, I'm sure it was a very interesting meeting. Yes, Ivil agreed. She was going to be remembering this too. Chapter 73, Tucked In. Sleep well, Ivil said as she carefully maneuvered the blanket up to 26's neck. 26 was blushing still, but she was also very much glaring up at Ivil, who was just a little worried that the joke had gone too far. This is silly, 26 said. Ivil grinned. Did you want me to read you a bedtime story? Maybe give you a little kiss before you fall asleep? Or would that make things worse? 26 said. She rolled her eyes, which really didn't do much to help her look any more mature. I'm not a baby. So you don't want me to treat you this way? Ivil asked. No tucking you in, no carrying you around, no more chaste goodnight kisses? 26 shifted in the bed, very clearly not meeting Ivil's eyes. I don't mind it. I mean, this doesn't feel like it's moving too fast, so it's mostly okay. But don't do it because you think I need it. Okay, Ivil agreed. I'll do it because I like it instead. She wasn't sure if that was the right answer or not, but 26 didn't protest. Are you going to bed too? No, I'll talk to Aurora some more. I don't actually need sleep, not unless I want it, Ivil said. Besides, I didn't pack any pajamas. Heh? I bet you have really nice ones. You know, Missy loves those. I heard as much, Ivil said. But no, I sleep in the nude. Good night, little tugboat. Ivil left the room with a genuine smile on her face. 26's embarrassed groaning was like a balm on her soul. She found Aurora in the living room still. She had changed into something less formal, which was a shame. Ivil really didn't mind it when Aurora went around in less. The fact that the noble was comfortable enough to do so was quite nice as well. How is it going? Ivil asked. Aurora was laying across one of the couches. It was one of those couches with the uncomfortable inserts for a person's legs, designed to hold one in place in the rooms lacking gravity. Of course, Ivil was giving everyone in the suit the opportunity to feel half a G of gravity. A little more than what they'd experience on Mars and half as much as they'd feel on Earth. It was healthier than experiencing a full gravity when they weren't used to it. "It's going well enough," Aurora said as she glanced up from a tablet. "We'll be leaving soon enough. You should get some sleep." "I don't need it," Ivil replied. "But you do. Care to follow your own advice?" "I'm a politician, Evelyn. You should know that doing what we tell others to do is not in our nature." Aurora looked up for a moment. "You truly don't need sleep?" "I can, if I want to," Ivil said. She moved to the far end of the couch and Aurora tugged her legs back to give her some room to sit. "But I rarely do. Sleep feels like a waste. I'll take a few hours here and there, especially when in transit, but it's more for mental recuperation and to pass the time than because I'm tired." "I see. Well, I wouldn't mind a night with this gravity, I suppose," Aurora said. "Oh, I can keep that going while sleeping," Ivil dismissed. Aurora blinked. "Most people can't keep an active ability core like that going while sleeping. Not as far as I know." "I'm not most people," Ivil said. "Though really, I just have some cores that assist me with managing my others." Aurora stared at her for a long time before speaking up. "Gravity cores. Some sort of teleportation. What I deeply suspect is a time manipulation core of some sort. Shield cores. Now self-management cores. Not to mention at least one weapon system that was able to take out that slug man." "Are we listing out my suspected cores now?" Ivil asked. "Yes," Aurora said. "At least, those you've shown me. You know, I suspected that you were a D-classer originally." It explained Pendergast's respect for you, even though she's clearly at least a C-classer herself. Ivil nodded. "She is, yes. But then you pull out more cores and tricks like a magician tugging scarves out of their sleeves. You're not a C-classer." "You sound quite certain," Ivil said. She looked down as Aurora placed her feet on her lap. A show of trust. Was she even aware? "It's common knowledge that cores change a person. That only makes sense. They are physical objects. They need a place to be. Mine show up on scans as thin strips here and there in my body. As a person accumulates more, the cores take up more space. They add limbs and new organs that allow them to function. Some people die from taking on too many of the wrong kind of core. Or not enough of the right kind," Ivil said. "You can die from hypovolemia if you take on too many cores that require blood circulation to function." "Not anemia?" Aurora asked. "Anemia is specific to red blood cells. Which does mean that it's part of hypovolemia, but it's more complex than that. If you take on a few cores that give you 10 more arms without a core that helps replenish blood, or take necessary medical precautions, you might die of blood loss without the loss." "Garish," Aurora said. "But, back to my point. People with 10 or more cores are C-classers. Sometimes they're obvious, more often than not it's subtle. More than 100 and it's hard to hide. 100 additions to any body is going to be visible. Mr. Slob is a B-classer, is he not?" "Yes," Ivil said. She had a sense for where this was going. He was quite powerful, but his cores changed him in a very obvious way, did they not? Metal limbs, a corpulent body. He looks more machine than man, but with all of the worst parts of biology still tacked on. He was rather unattractive. "And yet you were very attractive," Aurora said. She wiggled her toes a little as she said it. "Why, thank you. It's a statement of fact," Aurora said with a casual shrug. "You look like you were carved by a great artist. You feel warm and fleshy, at least in those few times where we've touched." She shifted a foot a little, the heel digging into Ivil's thigh. "And yet you have so many abilities, which naturally means that you have a lot of cores to impart them." Ivil nodded. "I never claimed otherwise. I noticed. So, common knowledge says that a D-classer can be subtle about their cores. A C-classer less so. A B-classer is a monster of flesh and machine. Which leaves A." She spoke the letter with finality. "How many A-classers are there? In the entire system?" "1,000 or so," Ivil said. But don't make the mistake of thinking they all look like attractive humans. Some decide that they don't mind being monstrous. Some lean into it, even. I've heard that kind of story, yes, Aurora said. But there are just as many stories about beautiful classers. You can keep calling me beautiful, if you want. I find it rather flattering, Ivil said. Aurora chuckled. I'm sure. So, why are you helping us? Haven't I made it abundantly clear? Ivil asked. You've given me some reasons, finding love and such, but I have a hard time believing it. An classer is the pinnacle of our modern world. You're the equivalent of a pre-career billionaire. I can't imagine it being hard to find someone attractive to woo in that kind of situation, especially since you're charismatic enough. Oh, I'm certain I could sleep with all sorts of people, Ivil replied with a shrug. But I don't just want sex, or for someone who loves me because of my power. I want real, true love. True love, Aurora repeated. She went quiet. It wasn't just for a moment. The quiet stretched and stretched as Aurora stared at nothing and sank deeper into her own thoughts. I think I might have wanted the same, once, she said at last. But I don't know if it's real. I've decided that it is, Ivil said easily. It wouldn't be the first time that I bend reality to my will. Aurora laughed. Confident, huh? For some reason it's a lot easier for me to accept that you create gravity from nothing than for me to imagine creating true love from the same. It's not created from nothing, Ivil said. The love, that is. I think it needs a connection. A spark. Or maybe that's just an experience and wishful thinking. There was a knock at the door and Ivil turned to glare at it. Someone was there, one of the delegates that she didn't care to remember the name of. And she was having so much fun just moments before. Chapter 74, Who are you and what do you want? Hello. The man on the other side of the door said. He was wearing a suit pulled off of a discount rack and a smile that was almost genuine. His hair was combed with his fingers and he wasn't standing level to the door, which only made sense. This didn't seem like someone competent enough to care about being level. The man next to the speaker was 2 heads taller, making him one of the few people that Ivil would have to look up to speak to. He had limbs that were longer than they ought to be, but Ivil couldn't sense any cores in him, hidden or otherwise. This was just a man that grew long. Hello, Ivil said. Who are you and what do you want? Ah, well, we're here for the after party. We noticed that Delegate Sterlingworth didn't pop out of her room, so we thought we'd do the neighborly thing and come on over. Delegate Green, Aurora said as she walked up behind Ivil. A pleasure to meet you again. The man, Delegate Green, Ivil supposed, nodded and tried a bow which made him shift in the air a little before he grabbed onto his zero-G travel drone. Nice to see you as well. I was wondering if you were going to pop over to any of the after meetings? After meetings? Aurora asked. You know, big meetings like today's are good and all, but all of the actual work gets done right after. Aurora didn't look like she knew that. Whatever she was going to say was interrupted as a second delegate flew over. An elderly woman accompanied by a stone-faced guardsman in a suit that was somehow crisper than Delegate Green's. Ah, you found her, Green, she said. Delegate Galatea, Aurora said with a slight bow. MHM. Well, you going to invite us in? The woman asked. Ah. Aurora glanced at Ivil, then shrugged faintly and stepped back from the doorway. Ivil did likewise, letting the group in. She sighed and extended her gravity generation to the lot of them. It would raise fewer questions than if she kept it limited to Aurora and herself. Whoa, that's properly nice, Green said as he collected himself then bounced on the spot a couple of times. Indeed, Aurora said while she gave Ivil a slight side eye. So, can't I assist you with anything? You can get drinks out, Galatea said. She stomped over to the couch and sat down onto it. Her guard took up position next to the door while scanning the room. He had a gun in that jacket, and at least one core linked to his eye, but Ivil dismissed him as a non-threat. Give me just a moment, then, Aurora said. I'll set some water to boil. There are soft drinks in the fridge there, if anyone wants any. Don't mind if I do, Green said as he wandered over. I make a point of grabbing every drink in these mini fridges. Oh, and all of the towels and such too. Which moon do you represent, exactly? Ivil asked. Saturn. He said. No one moon in particular, really. But if you have to ask, Hyperion. There was a slight shuffle, and 26 poked her head into the living room. She was wrapped up in a blanket still, as if she didn't dare untuck herself. Oh. I thought I heard a familiar accent, she said. Green blinked, then a wide smile appeared. EY. Delegate Sterlingworth, you didn't mention you had a Saturnian babe in your gang. You mean in my delegation team? Aurora asked. Yee, he said. Where are you from, babe? He asked. Ivil might have, under slightly different circumstances, detached Green's head and his body from each other, but 26 just smiled prettily, and she sensed that it wasn't an insult to call her babe. I'm from Layer 4 Section 4, 26 said. The old 4-4, yee. Ivil blinked. 26's accent had changed. Not too much, she usually spoke with a Spacer Standard accent that had just a slight bit of a twang to it, but now it had changed a little more, become more easygoing and informal. Yee, that's fantastic stuff. I'm from old Hyperion myself, but my brother here is from. What are you from? He asked the tall man. Layer 3, Section 2, he replies with a surprisingly high-pitched voice. Aurora returned with some tea just then, or at least a warm kettle. Forgive my ignorance, but layers. Sections? Oh, 26 said. Layers are the depth in the ring. The lower the layer, the closer to Saturn. Sections are quadrants around the planet. But there are 10 of them, so it's not really quadrant. Ah, so it's a way to identify where you're from in relation to Saturn. Yee, 26 said with a nod. There's a bit of, casual racism that goes with it too, unfortunately. The outermost layers had it best, and the inner layers, 1 and 2, have to deal with a lot more radiation and such, so they tend to be a bit weirder. We've been getting better about it, Green said. Saturn's got this weird red problem. Everyone knows we're the best engineers in the system, and yet they insist on thinking we're all backwards hicks. They are not mutually exclusive, Galatea said. She nodded her thanks to Aurora, then prepared her tea. Ah, it's nice to work with gravity. You'll have to tell me how you got your hands on a localized generator like that. I know some people, Aurora replied without looking Ivil's way. You mentioned earlier how after meetings were common? Oh, of course. No one will air out their private grievances in an official meeting. Nor will actual deals be struck there. It's too open, too public, the old lady replied as she clinked a spoon in her cup. Now's the real time for deals to be made. I see. And what kind of deals are you trying to make? Aurora asked. The old woman huffed. Isn't it obvious? If it was, I'm certain Aurora wouldn't have to ask, Ivil said. The woman huffed some more. We're here to deal, Lady Sterlingworth. The main thrust of today's meeting was dispensing each moon's share of the cores. These two Saturnians already made it clear enough that they don't care much for their share. That's not entirely true, Green said. It's valuable, we just can't make best use of them ourselves. Exactly. Galatea has little interest as well. Our moon has a sort of Damocles above it. We're just waiting out the centuries until we slip past the Roche limit and break up. Not so different from the position your Phobos was in before that Empress knocked you back into place. I see, Aurora said. So you're not interested in your share of the cores either. Oh. Don't think that for a moment. We'd make good use of those. Our family, an extended family, has become quite rich acting like the last pit stop to the S-end of the solar system, but we'll never be a major influence. We keep our heads down and are happy with just being rich and apart from all the rest. Ivil nodded. She wasn't too well versed in Neptunian politics, but the Galatea family at Neptune was somewhat known to her. They ran the failing moon as well as a few dozen stations in Neptune's rings. They collected resources and acted as a way station for deep system exploration. They weren't too dissimilar to Saturn in some ways. Plenty of natural resources, but nothing that others couldn't grab closer to home, and nothing to do with those resources themselves. They were relatively rich, all things considered. Not individually, but as a family. Their nation was strictly socialist. Almost violently so. All gains were shared equally, and all hardship borne the same way. The average Neptunian was actually far more wealthy, dollar for dollar, than just about anyone else in the solar system. But they were also stuck in their little corner, unable to leave without losing everything. It was the living embodiment of a sunk-cost world. More cores wouldn't help them. The wealth and favors earned from those cores, however. I think we could work something out, Aurora said. Phobos is not the wealthiest, but this kind of investment would mean a lot to us. Money is nice, favors are nicer, Galatea said. Oh, we'd settle for money, Green replied. But there are richer fish to drop this bait in front of. Just auctioning off all of the cores one at a time would bring us a small fortune. Not as much of a fortune as we could bring, Aurora said. Not unless you intend to sell to Mars or Earth or one of their proxies? That would burn our bridges with the League, Green said. But selling to individuals in core? That's a little easier to swallow. Aurora shook her head. What kind of favors would you trade for cores, then? Experts, medical facilities and supplies, some help putting pressure on the core that are preventing us from forming a proper government, Green listed off casually. He might have been a hick, but the man wasn't stupid, Ivil realized. Chapter 75, Safety and Security in Saturn. The talks continued. Ivil's interest did not. Still, she made an effort to remain attentive. Aurora was certainly keen to listen and discuss things with both parties. It was an interesting balancing act to observe. The Saturnians wanted things that were relatively easy to obtain around Mars. Medical facilities Mars had the best of these, bar few supplies and cash. They wanted the things that normal governments had and could provide to their citizens. 26 was entirely on board for that. Do you know how many problems my family and extended family had would have been solved if there were more medical facilities in the rings? She asked. Not even just that, I mean like, the kind of medical place that Mars and Earth has, where you don't need to pay. You pay for those through taxation, Aurora said. But yes, I understand what you mean. It would be life-changing. Aurora pinched her chin for a moment, then nodded. How many quarters did you divide your rings into? Sections, Green corrected. And there are 10 of them. I see. And 2 of Saturn's moons are properly colonized, correct? She asked. Yes, he replied. Why the geographical questions? I have a proposition, then, Aurora said. Phobos has a small fleet, mostly older Martian ships that we purchase for lower rates. Included in this fleet are a number of medical frigates. I don't remember the exact number, but there may well be a dozen of these. As far as I'm aware, they are not being used at the moment. Some will require retrofitting and modifications, but they can be brought up to tip-top for relatively little. How old are we talking here? Green asked. Ivil perked up. She knew this one. The Martian fleet had a large renovation about 8 years ago. We feared the onset of a 4th intersystem war that never occurred. Most of the ships of the line were replaced at that time as Martian factories went into full production. A lot of that new fleet replaced the old one, and the old one went into mothballs. Oh, that's a shame, 26 said. Those older ships were only 30 or 40 years old, Ivil replied. Definitely dated. Slower drives, worse sensor technology, inferior accommodations, and poorer shields. Replacing them was the right move. However, Mars can't just sell them. Old they might be by Martian standards, they are still comparable to the current general ships from most nations. In any case, what I mean to point out is that the medical frigates will be 40 years old at the oldest. That's not that bad, Green said. I mean, it ain't ideal, yee. But that's about the age of some of our facilities too. So, what's your plan, Lady Sterlingworth? Phobos will undertake the renovation of 12 of these ships. They are medical frigates, so they are not all that large, but I think they can take a decent throughput of patients all the same. We'll undertake the improving of this medical fleet at our own expense and provide them with an escort. Perhaps. Phobos has a large fleet of corvettes. Oh. 26 said as she bounced on the spot. Phobosian corvettes are hot. Hot? Ivil asked. They are sleek, long, with a thin vertical profile, 26 said. They look a bit like stingrays, the fish. Animal things from Earth? Definitely some of the prettiest ships around. They are designed by a firm that usually produces luxury ships, Aurora said. I believe they are considered to be rather underwhelmingly armed, but that same firm produces racing ships. They are very maneuverable and rapid, with exceptionally comfortable crewing arrangements. Go on, then, Ivil replied. Aurora nodded. I can secure 24 corvettes for, call it 1 year and a month of service, along with 12 medical frigates, staffed and operated by Phobos. In exchange for 1 year of service, Saturn will give us their supply of cores. Green leaned back, then shook his head. Too little, he replied. And we can guarantee the safety ourselves, though maybe not in transit. Aurora hummed. 2 years. Make it 10, Green returned, then he raised a hand. No. How about you service the ships yourselves for a year, then lease the frigates to Saturn at a favorable price for the next 9 years. By the end they'll be at the end of their service life, so maybe we can negotiate buying the ships outright. 10 years of medical services is a lot, Aurora said. We have our own doctors and staff. Not many, but some. What if we use the frigates as a sort of training opportunity? Oh, yes, I can see that working, Aurora replied. Phobos has a very robust medical system. We have been the place where Martians come to have unusual and discreet operations completed for decades now, so we've always had a vested interest in having good doctors. I can maybe secure a few teachers as well, to train any Saturnian nurses and general practitioners up to our standard. We might be able to do an exchange of sorts? Green let out a breath, his shoulders drooping in relief. That would be incredible. It would loosen the corporate hold on our people a great deal for them to have the option to take government-provided medical care, and it would do wonders to help encourage the average Saturnian to participate in our own legitimate governance of the rings. Yeah, the rings are all corpo, 26 said. I didn't even know what the U-word was until I left Saturn. The U-word? Ivil asked. 26 nodded, then flushed a little. When she next spoke, it was in a hushed whisper, as if she was saying something incredibly taboo. Union, she said. Be that as it may, Aurora said. I think it would also seem like a novel opportunity to promote Phobian philanthropy. That is, if you want to obscure the reason for the trade? Green hummed, then nodded. That's acceptable, he replied. Thank you, genuinely. This will save many lives. Ivil felt like it was a little short-sighted. Sure, this would save lives, but they were trading away dozens of cores for it. She wasn't sure if the value proposition even matched. What bothered her more was the loss of eventual power. Those cores given to one talented person could turn into more cores, which could snowball. In the long term, it would mean more dead Saturnians, but it might also eventually lead Saturn to having their own Bureauclasser. Still, she remained silent. This was Aurora's negotiation, and her friend's heart was in the right place. The Saturnians were desperate, and perhaps this gesture of goodwill would foster alliances that outweighed the raw value of the cores. Very well, Aurora said with a soft smile. We have a deal. I'll begin the arrangements immediately. Galatea raised her teacup in a mock toast. To the future then, Lady Sterlingworth. May it be as bright as your intentions. Thank you, Aurora said. But you haven't said what you want for your moon's cores, Miss Galatea. Money, was the immediate, clipped response. Aurora blinked. We can do money, she replied. And then they dove into what was essentially a long-winded negotiation that Ivil didn't care as much about. As the delegates settled into more relaxed conversation, Ivil found herself drifting towards 26, who was still bundled in her blanket and looking positively edible. Did you understand all that? 26 asked in a hushed whisper, her accent reverting back to its usual twang. Most of it, Ivil replied. It's a complex game we're playing, but I think Aurora knows what she's doing. 26 nodded thoughtfully. I hope so. Aurora is so smart. And pretty. You know, this is going to save a lot of lives. People like me. I bet there's 100 other 26s out in the rings that could really use that help. I'm certain there's only one 26 that I care for, Ivil replied. But I see what you mean. I never was one for philanthropy. But I can see why it might make someone more attractive. It was another hour before Aurora and Galatea shook hands, having hammered out a deal that sounded rather poor to Ivil. Aurora was paying more for unknown cores than most would. Ivil supposed that it was a gamble, but Phobos had more money than it had easy access to new cores, so it made some sense. The delegates finally took their leave, and 26 returned to bed with a large, jaw-cracking yaw. Even Pepper retired for the night after having been relegated to the edges of the room and the discussion. That was intense, Aurora admitted. You did well, Ivil said, placing a reassuring hand on Aurora's shoulder. Better than I could have. Aurora smiled gratefully. We'll see if it pays off. For now, we've bought ourselves some time and goodwill. I hope it'll be worth something in the real conference. Interlude, at your service, Part 1. Silent sentinel washer at the gate slid into its moorings with the measured grace of a maid slipping into a busy kitchen. The vessel was once a Martian pocket cruiser. Once. That may have been 2 generations ago, however. Now the silent sentinel washer at the gates was a prideful ship of the tech maids of Mars. She was repainted in the austere blacks and grays and whites of the Order. Red heraldry hung over her, like tapestries upon a medieval castle's walls. The ship, as most Martian vessels, was built vertically, a massive pillar that moved under the power of huge engines bulging out of her rear. There were, Sonic Spectre suspected, few stock parts left on the venerable pocket cruiser. Young Miss 26 would have adored seeing her. The silent sentinel washer at the gates had navigated the busy space around Driftwood Station with care. Even now, she was politely speaking with the station, keeping a constant flow of information going while the officers on board continued the rites of station-bound communication. Other, smaller vessels were guided out of her path, and curious onlookers were tagged and addressed by tech maids ready and willing to spread the word of the Ordo to any and all willing to listen. Finally, the vessel came to a stop. Mooring arms moved from one of the larger piers on Driftwood and connected to her sides, and long airlock tubes were unfolded and locked into place. These tubes were lined with windows, allowing Sonic Spectre to see the black-clothed figures of the Adeptus and Celia swiftly making their way towards the station proper. She moved away from the viewing window and into the lobby space where she would be able to better greet her siblings in Maycraft. This space wasn't entirely private. There were onlookers and gawkers, many of them had started by blatantly staring at her, then the ship moored just outside. None of them had approached her. That might have been her own fault. Sonic didn't want to be approached at the moment, and so she was making no effort to hide her manicures. Her entire body flicked and flickered, sometimes moving several centimeters to the left or right, and her mechanical grasping appendages were plainly visible beneath the hem of her maidly uniform. Even the least knowledgeable person would know that she had several cores when she was flaunting them so. The last airlock into the lobby space opened, and the Homeguard of the Adeptus and Celia walked into Driftwood in lockstep. 7 men in suits with trailing tailcoats and large lapels. Masks covered their faces, with several hoses reaching out over their shoulders into small packs on their lower backs, and they wore thick leather-like belts that had tabards dangling from them filled with a small panoply of tools. A person from the early 20th century might have assumed that they were something like a mechanic cosplaying as a butler, and they wouldn't have been entirely incorrect. 6 of the 7 arrayed themselves in 2 rows leading into the airlock. The 7th came to stand before her. They all, at the same moment, folded an arm before their waist and another at the small of their back, then they bowed at an exacting 30 degrees. "Greetings, Savant son of Pendergast," they spoke in unison. Then the tech made the tech butler if one wished to use the gender-specific terminology, and the lead spoke on his own. I am Sentinel Arthur Hesk, Subtle of Ceremonies, brother of the Order of the Home. Greetings, Sentinel Hesk, Sonic said. Are you to escort me? At your leisure, my lady savant, he replied smoothly. Or as smoothly as someone whose voice was warped by a mask could be. Sonic nodded, and accepted the Sentinel's arm when he extended it to her. Technically, she didn't need to accept his arm. Accepting it put her above the Sentinel, as per Ancilia protocol. In her role as a tech maid, that wasn't entirely accurate, but in her role as an agent of the Empire of Mars it was entirely appropriate. She was straddling a strange line at the moment. Previously her split roles were simpler to digest. She was Sonic Spectre first. Valkyrie of Mars. She served the Martian Navy from dawn to dusk. Her involvement with the Adeptus Ancilia was something she'd adopted when very young, but not her calling or creed. The Adeptus Ancilia had helped her career though, giving her access to better training and knowledge that would otherwise have been hard to gather. And so she returned the favor here and there. She kept to the customs and rose through the ranks in the few spare moments she had when she was free of Valkyrie work. Those moments had become rarer and more fleeting with time, but the Order also treated her with more deference. The Order existed to serve those with cores. She had cores. Enough to be a solid B-classer. Enough to have left much of her humanity behind. If it wasn't for the Order and its teaching, and even its direct assistance, then the transition from C to B-classer might have been enough for her to lose herself. People didn't know it, because there were so few examples around, but losing one's human form after gaining so many hundreds of cores was also likely to have one lose their human mind. Too many lost themselves. Not just the memory of their own physicality, but their very minds and perhaps their souls. The Order had helped her keep her mind intact. She owed them much for it. It allowed her to be one of Mars' few B-class Valkyries, one of a few hundred. She was nervous about approaching the hallowed realms of the A-class. The space where people turned from mechanical, core-welding monsters into whatever they damned well pleased. What would she become, when she reached that level of mastery over reality itself? Having spent some time now in close proximity to the Empress of Mars herself, Sonic was more conflicted than she would be willing to ever admit. Ivil Antagonist was a monster. She was very human. Sonic was likely going to be talking about her soon enough. They reached the outer airlock of the ship. They opened with a hiss, and Sentinel Hest gestured her in. As the airlock cycled she recentered herself. Then they opened and Sonic found herself at the head of a procession. 100 maids stood in 2 neat rows, stretching out ahead of her to the left and right. They wore the blacks and whites of the Order, with a few visual differences in their cut and garb hinting at their stations aboard the ship. They stood in a grand lobby. A space carved out of the cruiser specifically to be ostentatious, to wow any guest coming aboard. A grand staircase swept upwards at the far end of a hall lined with Martian redstone. The room made no effort to disguise what it was, however. Maintenance panels sat in their places, ducts ran across the ceiling, neatly laid wires hugged the walls, each in their place and color-coded for convenience. Greetings, the maids said as one. They courtesied in time with each other. One stood at the far end of the group. A tech maid in an elaborate red dress, hood pulled low to hide her still organic face. 6 arms were folded before her, neat and poised. Sonic allowed her senses to travel the room. It hummed. The ship was alive. She did make out chatter and whispers from the rooms adjoining this hall. Younger members of the Order doing what they did best. Spreading gossip. Well, some traditions were harder to squash than others, she supposed. Stepping up while still clinging to Sentinel Hesk, though she led at the moment she made her way down the procession of maids. Each one of them standing up to full attention as she crossed them until, finally, she stood before the head maid. Greetings, Sonic Spectre said. I am Savant Son of Pendergast, keeper of pristine networks, sister of the Order of the Wet Mop. I have come to report. Might I have your permission to come aboard? The face beneath the cowl smiled. It was kindly and gentle. Hello, sister. I am Dedicate Helen Kirkland, voice of Pristine Holmes, Sister of the Order of the Broom Cupboard. I welcome you aboard the silent sentinel washer at the gates. Come. Let's have refreshments and a little chat. I'm certain you have some very juicy gossip to share. She didn't know the half of it, Sonic thought. Let's, please, she replied. And so she was gently escorted into a room with several lounge chairs, many well-tended plants, a small library, and a warm kettle of tea. Most strikingly, however, the room was decorated by a single painting hung on the far wall. 6 meters by 10, oil on canvas. It was an image of one of the people the Adeptus and Celia venerated most. A massive machinery in organic parts, kilometers long. Arms like spiral galaxies and eyes enough to drive the sane mad. The person in the image was in the process of eating a fleet of the Earth Alliance. Sonic mused, for a moment, on the irony of reporting about the Empress of Mars under a painting of the very same Empress back in the time before she had taken on a more humble appearance. Interlude, at your service, Part 2. Sonic paused by her seat, the lesser of the two placed across from each other on either end of the lone coffee table in the room. Dedicate Kirkland moved to the larger, more plush of the two seats, then carefully gestured for Sonic to sit. She sat. The older woman smiled and adjusted her robes while sitting. Then she started a simple tea ceremony. There was a clink as she tapped out an appropriate amount of tea leaves into a glass device. How do you like yours? She asked. Plain, Sonic replied. She had long ago lost her stomach. For that matter, she had no esophagus or even a mouth. All the speaking she did was through a cord that allowed her to manipulate sounds. She thought that she might regret the choice, but it was surprisingly easy to grow past the need to eat or drink. In any case, there was no point in wasting more than just one cup of tea. The Dedicate poured 2 cups, then carefully moved one of them with her second set of arms so that it rested before Sonic. There, she said. Whenever you're ready, sister. Sonic nodded, then carefully adjusted her sitting position and swept her hands down her lap to press out any unsightly wrinkles in her skirt. Is there a particular place you want me to begin? She asked. The Dedicate shook her head. We have access to your reports up to the entering of the ship known as the Hell Together. Afterwards, nothing except for a letter informing the Martian Admiralty of your prompt and imminent desertion. Ah, I see. How did they take it? She asked. All things considered, rather well, Dedicate Kirkland said. She took a sip from her cup after blowing across it. The circumstances allowed for a great deal of speculation amongst the few members of the brass who were cleared to know them. And the Ordo learned of my circumstances how? She asked. That was her one point of contention in all of this. She hadn't informed the Adeptus and Celia. They had simply known. Though to be fair, the Dedicate here was a high-ranking member of the organization, and she had no reason to believe that things had spread beyond that. We have friends in many organizations around Mars. But a lot of what we do know comes from Mint. Not through spies or people who spilled secrets, but as a direct warning. She shifted in her seat slightly and gave her teacup to 2 of her metallic hands. They warned us not to interfere the moment your desertion came to light. We asked for more, and they provided. Sonic nodded slowly. She'd almost forgotten about all of that. She was, technically, no longer a member of the Martian Navy. Ivil has forced her to sign away that belonging. And now her own brothers and sisters of the Adeptus and Celia didn't know where they stood. Hence, this very moment. She thought back to the moment where she'd agreed to serve the Empress. Had there been anything about keeping her secrets? Technically, no. She had merely told Sonic that she didn't want someone whose loyalties were split. And so Sonic now had to choose what to say. The truth wouldn't be breaking any rules, but it would spit in the spirit of what the Empress had asked. No one survived spitting at the Empress. So Sonic started to dance. I was ordered to leave the service of the Martian Navy, she said. By whom? And why, if I may ask, did you choose to obey such a thing? Sonic turned her head away from the Dedicate and instead faced the painting on the far wall. It truly was a masterwork. Had the painter been there? She narrowed her vision down to a plaque beneath the image. It dated it to half a decade after the Third Inter-System War. So perhaps not an eyewitness's art. I believe that, were I to report this, I may well be ordered to leave the Adeptus Ancilia as well. The dedicant sat a little taller. You would abandon your oaths and mately way of life? No, I would not, Sonic said. But I would abandon the organization in order to better conduct myself as is appropriate for a member of the Ordo. The dedicant stared for a long time, her lips drawn into a thin line. It's a beautiful painting, Sonic said. Is it? I've studied it for some hours. It's not realistic, of course. The real battle happened across hundreds of thousands of kilometers. The image squeezes in the Earth Alliance fleet far too much. Indeed. I'd suspected as much. The Empress was quite different back then. Now she seems far more human. Did you know, once you talk to her, you discover that she has scandalously human desires. No, don't scowl at me. This is no blasphemy. She is the Empress still. As poised and regal and deadly as ever. But she has the wants of a person, nonetheless. I suspect that her return to a human form after the tribulations of the early and late class have encouraged her to rekindle her humanity. It's quite beautiful. Is it? It is, Sonic said. Would that she had a member of the Ancilia close to her now, to serve and protect. Ah, the dedicant said. She settled her cup into its saucer. The rim clattered slightly. She placed it onto the table and folded all 6 hands over her lap, fingers intertwined. How can the Adeptus Ancilia help? A sudden change of pace, but one that removed a weight of stress from Sonic's back. She welcomed it. Interference at this time may be unwise. However, there is opportunity. Sonic leaned back and considered how to handle this for a moment. Ivil may well be irate if the Adeptus Ancilia broke her cover with her potential mates. That would be the first hurdle. Could the Ancilia help beyond keeping its distance? It was very likely. They had little influence here, around Jupiter, but little wasn't none. The Adeptus Ancilia also had a decently strong military capability. This ship alone was large enough to deter most pirates, and it wasn't the jewel of the Adeptus Ancilia fleet. The Empress is being subtle. More so than ever before. I am acting as her liaison, but I believe that she doesn't want the fact of her existence here to be known by any. I understand, and I will endeavor to make the rest of the Ordo understand as well, Dedicate Kirkland said. It may be best if instead of making them understand, the truth was simply kept to as few as possible, Sonic said. I am risking much by admitting this already. I see. Your bravery shan't go unnoticed. I appreciate it, Dedicate. Sonic clasped her hands together and made a small sign of reconciliation and then shifted into the sign for a change of subjects. This didn't go unnoticed to the Dedicate, who had likely gone through 10,000 such ceremonies. There is someone I met that might be of minor interest to the Ordo. Oh. 2 people, actually, with potentially a third. Or fourth. It's a complex matter. But the one I wish to highlight is a young woman, a Saturnian by birth and upbringing. We have few members from Saturn, though it isn't unheard of, the Dedicate said. Culturally, they tend to chafe under the strictness of the Ordo. I can see that, yes. The young lady I speak of may also have some difficulties in adapting. But I think she's worth the Ordo's time. She has a brilliant mind. And she has interest in becoming a member? I don't believe so. She does have a single core at the moment. The mandate of the Adeptus Ancilia was to assist those with cores. But, generally speaking, they tended to assist those with more cores more often than those with few. A single core would barely put someone on the Ordo's metaphorical radar, though it would earn their attention. I think it may be wise for the tech maids of Mars to assist this young woman with her further education, outside of the bounds of the Order itself. Perhaps seeding her into one of the Martian engineering colleges? An interesting request, and certainly something we could accommodate. But why? Because doing so would give you an excuse for being there, and a reason for me to be speaking to you now. The Dedicate stared, or so Sonic chose to believe. Her eyes were still hidden by her cowl. Very well, then, consider it done. Thank you. Now, There are a few more minor requests that I believe may be helpful. Chapter 76, In the Pocket. Ivil imagined that something was up the moment she noticed the tech-made ship hovering next to Driftwood Station. The ship, likely some sort of cruiser, or a large destroyer judging by the size of it, was hard to miss. It was moored in a station next to the one that housed the SFO and was half as tall as some of the larger stations that made up Driftwood. There were a few cargo vessels that were about as large or larger, but none of those bristled with guns or were as sleek as the modified Martian warship. There were few reasons for the tech maids to be this far from home. Her presence was one of them. They'd always done their utmost to hound her wherever she went, believing that their religious superstitions about cores and machines gave them the right to stick their nose in her business. Usually it was relatively harmless. She suspected she could make the entire order weep with joy if she just accepted one invitation for tea with their leadership, but Ivil wasn't truly tempted to waste her own time like that. "Whoa," 26 said. She had her nose pressed up to the viewport of their shuttle as they hovered past the tech-made ship. "That's a beauty. Did you see her, Evelyn?" "I did," she replied. "Some old Martian cruiser, I imagine." "A pocket cruiser," 26 corrected. "It's a post-Second Inter-System warship, back when the Earth Alliance and the Empire of Mars had just signed the Luna Accords." "The Accords limiting the size of warships?" Aurora asked. She was lounging back in one of the shuttle's comfortable seats, a small pad balanced on a knee where she was reading a report or another. Their trip back from a Presorex station had been as unexciting as their trip there had been exciting. So far, no one had tried to kill or ambush them. It was almost like whomever had tried gave up, at least for the moment. It made Ivil's hackles rise, knowing that the first attempt might have been nothing more than blind opportunism. Someone was playing a game out here, and she didn't know what that was. "That's the one," 26 said. "That one was great." "It was a political farce," Aurora said. "The ink wasn't dry before both sides were violating it." "Huh? Oh, sure, but it meant that both Mars and Earth created a whole new fleet of warships. Many ones, to get around the limits of the Accord, I guess. It's always cool to see ships that are designed to squeak past some hard, arbitrary limit. Like that pocket cruiser. It's only a little longer than a frigate, and tonnage-wise it's barely in the cruiser range, but it's definitely got a cruiser's complement of weapons. They had to sacrifice a whole heap of things to fit that much bang in that small a package, which makes it super neat. I bet the engineering under those hull plates is something else." "I don't believe Mars continued making pocket cruisers, did they?" Ivil asked. "Huh? Oh no, it's a stupid idea. There's a reason ships are the size that they are. Sure, you might be able to cram things into such a small package, but just because you can doesn't mean it's a good idea. I mean, look at that ship. See the space between the first and second hardpoint. There was definitely another turret emplacement there, but it got removed. And you can see from the way the thruster pack juts out that the hull was modified and made a little fatter. Probably to give better access from the interior." "I see," Ivil said. "Maybe one day I'm going to sit you in on the board of engineers for the Martian Navy and have you tell them how to do their jobs." 26 giggled. "Oh, I'd have a few ideas," she said. "But no, they do a good enough job. It's the politicians and such, giving them silly limitations that really get in the way. On behalf of my fellow politicians." "Stab away," Aurora said. 26 shook her head. "If you wanna see what happens when the limits are all off, take a look at one of those super dreadnoughts. A ship that has carrying capacity for an entire squadron of frigates. That's nuts." Ivil patted 26 on the head. Soon enough, they were coming in to dock at the shuttle bay, and everything seemed to be in order. That was, until Aurora perked up. "Our escort wants to meet with us," she said. "You mean Pixie?" 26 asked. "Yes, Miss Starling," Aurora confirmed. "She sent me a private message asking to meet before we continue. She suggested a spacer bar that's quite close to the docking facility. It's reasonable to expect an escort to want to debrief after a mission where unexpected combat was seen," Pepper said. Ivil had almost forgotten that woman was there. Pepper really had a gift for blending in when she wanted to. "I wouldn't mind stopping by to see her again," Ivil said. "And I'm sure she has a professional opinion to give about what happened on our way to Aprosorax." Someone had tried to kill Ivil, which was common enough. But trying to kill 26 and Aurora? Now that was far less forgivable, and unfortunately far easier to accomplish. Maybe she'd have to do something about that, actually. The shuttle stewards asked them to return to their seats soon after, and they started through docking procedures to link up to the station. Ivil extended her senses past the exterior of the ship, which gave her a good view of Pixie's nightshade slipping into a smaller docking bay nearby. Pepper assured them that their luggage would be taken care of and shipped back to the SFO, so with nothing to truly worry about, and with no customs to deal with, they left the shuttle and slipped into the larger station without issue. "What was the name of that bar?" 26 asked. "The Dead Swan," Aurora said. "Which isn't an auspicious name. Do you believe that she's sending a message with that choice?" Pepper asked. "No, probably not. It's the nearest spacer bar to this part of the docks," Aurora said. "I wouldn't read too much into it." Pepper nodded slowly. She was probably, Ivil imagined, going to read into it anyway. Mint loved their subtle hints and not so subtle symbolism. They worked those into a lot of their codes and passphrases and their internal memes. It made the organization that much more obtuse to understand. Ivil followed after the others, but quickly noticed that while Pepper was preoccupied trying not to grab any attention, and 26 was idly scanning any ships visible through the viewports to the outside, Aurora was looking at the people. "You're intent," Ivil said as she walked up next to her. "Oh, I'm people watching. Anything interesting to see?" Ivil asked. The people here mostly seemed like normal civilians. Some dock workers, a few business people on the move, even a few small families, groups of friends, and what looked like one larger group of tourists. Aurora shrugged. "It's what you don't see, sometimes, as much as it is what you do. Driftwood is peaceful at the moment. Did you see any security?" "Now that you mention it, no," Ivil said. She scanned further, and did find one guard half asleep in a station 2 floors up. "Is that a bad sign?" "It can either mean that the security situation is really poor, lacking funds or the like, or there's just no need for heightened security. That can be a great sign. It means that people aren't as nervous or worried, and that violent crime is low. We've encountered some strange people here," Ivil said. "This place isn't free of crime by any means. Though maybe this part of the station in particular is safe enough? Like a good neighborhood." "Maybe," Aurora said. "I feel like maybe there should be more security. And it's not like there's a visible lack of dock workers at the moment. They happened to cross a security station at the moment, one that was clearly just empty." "You believe the security is missing, then?" "Or relocated," Aurora said. "Jupiter doesn't have a formal army." "Not really. But it does have a large security and policing apparatus. With the big conference coming up, it's possible that security was innocently relocated to keep delegates safe or to keep an eye on things. Or there might be a more sinister motive to everything?" Ivil asked. Aurora hummed. "I think it behooves us to assume the worst, sometimes." Ivil grinned. If things went wrong, then maybe she'd have more chances to impress the girls. On the other hand, disasters didn't make for good dating opportunities, did they? Chapter 77, Terribly Normal. The spacer bar wasn't as bad as Ivil might have feared. Certainly it wasn't a top-class establishment, and it could use some minor renovations, but it was mostly clean and its current patronage seemed rather reserved. Technically it was very early on Driftwood Station. There was a 24-hour clock to divide most shifts, and they'd arrive at the station sometime in the early AM. Any rabble-rousers or after-shift partying would be over by the time they arrived. Ivil spotted Pixie waiting for them already. The petite woman had picked out a larger table in a back corner of the bar and was nursing a drink all on her own. She perked up when she saw Ivil and the girls coming in. "Hey, good to see you," she said. "Come on, pick a seat." Ivil did just that, sitting across from Pixie in the middle of the table. It was a clever bit of placement. No matter where the others sat, they'd need to be on either side of her, ensuring that she had someone on both sides. It did leave her back to the entrance, something which she generally disliked as a matter of principle, but it wasn't like she didn't have senses that could be extended beyond herself to scan for trouble. Aurora adjusted her blouse, then carefully sat on Ivil's right. 26 spun the chair on her left around and straddled it, arms crossed over its back and a smug grin on full display. Ivil suspected that 26 thought she looked cool. "You seem to be in a good mood, Miss Starling," Aurora said. Pixie grinned from ear to ear and leaned way forwards. "You bet. Do you know how many of my missions end up seeing any amount of combat? Aren't you like a super cool bounty hunter? And your ship is awesome. That kind of thing can't be cheap, so I bet you see a lot," 26 said. Pixie laughed. "Not nearly as much as you might think. Even the most dangerous escort missions only see combat one time in 10. And that's enough to make them the most dangerous?" 26 asked. "Yeah. You worked on a commercial ship, right?" Pixie asked her. "How often did you get waylaid by pirates or the like?" In the last 4 years? Maybe 3 times. And twice we just dumped and ran," 26 said. "Right. No company worth their O2 will try to take dangerous routes. A 1 in 10 chance of being attacked is a huge liability, which is why even the most dangerous possible paths are avoided if at all possible. And when they can't be, they hire on escorts like me. Usually not just 1 or 2 either, but a small flight of fighters and support ships for longer haul missions. In reality, I get maybe 1 mission in 20 where I see any combat. And that combat is usually short and quick. Pirates are just as risk-averse as companies. Which is only logical," Aurora said. "They are a business of a sort as well." "Exactly. Half the time the moment they see that they're up against someone with teeth, they cut and run." Pixie grinned big. "And I have big teeth." She probably thought she looked threatening. Ivil thought she looked like someone who needed their cheeks pinched. "Anyway, I'm mostly happy because nothing gets my blood boiling like a good dogfight. And combat pay too. You do remember the clause in my contract about combat pay, right, Miss Sterlingworth?" Aurora nodded demurely. "There's nothing to worry about, you will receive your payment in full," she said. "Phobos does not renege on deals. Not when you saved us out there." "Oh, speaking of saving us," 26 said. She tried to lean forwards, but couldn't on account of being seated improperly, so she just ended up bouncing on the spot. "What were you fighting out there?" "Those weren't pirates, I can tell you that much," Pixie said. "You can tell so easily?" Ivil asked. Pixie nodded. "Pirates come in 2 flavors most of the time, with very few exceptions. The first are flying around in converted ships. Freighters and tugs and small shuttles converted to be armed and up-armored. Some are even pretty decent ones properly converted. The second flavor are ships made in and around series. Vessels made by some of the larger pirate consortiums. Those tend to be used by the more professional crews. I suppose the third option is old military gear. Dated cast-me-downs from the last inter-system war or bought off from military surplus, but those are less common than you'd think nowadays." Aurora nodded. "Several treaties have arisen, cracking down on the trade of military goods. I can't imagine them being entirely successful, but it should make it harder to get that kind of equipment with ease." "So, if the attackers weren't mere pirates, who were they?" Ivil asked. Pixie shrugged. "I've been over the recordings. Something weird went down in that fight. Anyway, I looked at all the footage I had of the ships. I'm not a betting woman, but if I was, I'd put money down on the 3 being corporate security." 26 blinked. "Oh. There were 4 ships, right? I remember Evelyn showing me them. 3 titanium Pearl Mark 6s, or 7s. And a TMCC 600, right?" "That's it," Pixie said. "The Pearls are pretty damn common for corporate security around here. They are kinda trashy but cheap, and better than what poorer pirates can slap together. You'll see plenty of them flying patrols around stations. And the TMC is just a modified shuttle gunship, 26 said. Anyone could have that. Yes, but it was well modified, Pixie said. My ship has good cameras. The job was professional. Aurora hummed. So, what you're saying is that whomever tried to kill us were professionals. Ah, that depends on what you mean by that, Pixie said. Professionals in the sense that they're on a payroll? Then yes. Professional in the sense that they were good? Not so much. Does that help us narrow down who to get retribution from? Ivil asked. Actually, now that she thought about it, it might make for a fun date. Perhaps not with 26 or Aurora, unless the retribution was financial, in which case the Phobian princess would certainly enjoy it, but with Pixie. It was an idea. Pixie shrugged. You'll need a Venn diagram of every corporation and moon in the region that can afford to hire security like that and who want you dead. All the numbers on the ships were stripped off. No IFF, no markings. Which is only to be expected. We won't be able to point to a single organization, then, Aurora said. Except that now a company is missing 4 security ships, Pixie said. For the bigger corps, that's nothing. For a smaller corporation, that's a pretty hefty loss. A few million, at least. Whoa, 26 said. Ivil shrugged, then glanced over to Pepper, catching the quiet young woman's eye. I'm certain someone could do some digging and discover that. They left a trail, after all. Pepper nodded subtly. Mint would be on the case soon enough, then. Which meant Ivil would have to wait. Once she could pin down those responsible, she could go out and stretch her legs a little. She listened to Pixie and Aurora go on for a little bit, until 26 took over with questions about the actual dogfight, with much gushing over how cool and awesome the Nightshade was. Pixie seemed proud, though Ivil suspected that she was missing the fact that 26 was more complimentary about the fighter craft than about the pilot. They ordered some food, and of course some drinks. Pixie had to be complimented for a job well done, after all, and Ivil soon relaxed. She had been eager to move on, maybe take another step, maybe invite someone on a date, but this? Sitting around, chatting, trading gossip over warm food with plenty of laughter? That wasn't too bad. She imagined that once the dating phase of a relationship was over, there would have to be a much longer stretch where the focus was on spending quality time together, and this seemed like exactly the kind of thing that would happen. So she allowed herself to luxuriate in the atmosphere, prompted a few questions, and traded banter when appropriate. It was very nice, being so abjectly normal. Of course, she was also plotting to ruin the lives of the people responsible for that attack. No matter what happened, they had to be made an example of. She found that people, governments and corporations especially, tended to take fewer risks if there were clear and pressing examples of what would happen to them if their risk-taking didn't pan out. But that would be an issue for later. For now, drinks and good food and better company. Chapter 78, Quiet Times. One must appreciate the quiet times when they can. Ivil had served in the Martian Navy for long enough to understand that. To someone unfamiliar to military life, the hurry up and wait mentality could be strange and strenuous. To those raised in it, it was just the way things were. No one wanted to be the one causing others to wait, so the best policy was to hurry at all times. Better to have nothing to do than to have to be the one rushing so that things could move along elsewhere. She had grown long used to time off afforded to her simply because no one else could keep up. Once, she had even flown ahead and wiped out a small fleet before the Navy could get into the formations it wanted to. It had taken both her side and the adversaries by surprise and afforded her several days where she had nothing more important to do than listen to the complaints of tactical officers and catch up to her soaps. So the current situation wasn't all bad. She was back on the SFO, waiting in the captain's room while idly reading through the brief Mint had given her all of a week ago. Looking up, Ivil placed the tablet aside and gestured to the door. "Ah, hello, Sonic," Ivil said as she opened it with a stray thought. The techmate bowed at the hip before taking a single dainty step into the room. It was somewhat cramped with 2 people within. Certainly, this was the captain's cabin, But that didn't mean it was spacious. "Greetings," she said. There was the faintest of whispers as she shielded them from anyone trying to listen in. "Empress Antagonist. You weren't here when we returned," Ivil said. "Or on the hell together. I imagine you visited your friends on that cruiser?" "Indeed. I was on board the Silent Sentinel washer at the gates. I hope that my absence hasn't caused any issues." "No, not as far as I can tell," Ivil replied. She tilted her head to one side. "Did you return to report?" "If you would allow me, yes," Sonic Spectre said. Ivil gestured again, and the tech maid saluted as she subtly shifted her posture from that of a demure maid to that of a soldier reporting to a superior officer. Less bowing, more saluting, and somehow her back got even straighter. "The tech maids of Mars are tangentially aware of your presence in the system and are willing to assist you in any way," Sonic replied. Ivil pursed her lips. She'd rather they didn't know at all, but she couldn't entirely fault Sonic for it. Had the leak come from the Martian side of things? Did Sonic let them know so that they wouldn't cause trouble? "Anything interesting to report?" Ivil asked. "I have gathered a list of ship sightings in and around Jupiter," Sonic replied. "Movement from politicians and allies of the tech maids of Mars, and more interestingly, a list of cores currently for sale or about to enter auctions in the Jovian system. There are also several tech maids in the employ of the Emperor of Jupiter's larger retinue who have some information that may be of interest, but nothing too crucial." "I see," Ivil replied. "One moment." She slipped past the tech maid and towards the door, which she opened just as Pepper was raising her hand to knock. The Mint agent stared. "Enter," Ivil said. "And do tell me how you made it on board so easily. I don't recall you being part of the Sipho's crew." Pepper slid into the captain's cabin and scanned the room at a glance. "Forgive me for saying this, but Miss 26 is perhaps not the most guarded of people. She let me on board without a question." "Ah. Well, that's fair, I suppose," Ivil said. "Maybe 26 was a little bit of a security liability? No soldier would let a stranger on board a ship without proper authorization, but 26 was no soldier. Ivil couldn't and wouldn't hold her up to that kind of standard." Pepper and Sonic greeted each other with perfunctory politeness while Ivil watched them both. The Martian intelligence agent seemed to have all of the suspiciousness that 26 lacked and more. "Have you come to report as well?" Ivil asked. "Ah, yes ma'am," Pepper said as she straightened. "I was in touch with my superiors and have updated reports on a multitude of subjects. Political movements, the locations of politicians, the sightings of a few fleet elements in and around the Jovian system. I, likewise, have similar information," Sonic Spectre added. They stared at each other. There was no glaring there, but Ivil could almost feel the competitive sparks between the two. "You both realize that none of that information matters to me, yes?" she said. It was like emptying a 55-gallon drum of cold water atop a flickering matchstick. The two stared at her, then their gazes met. Pepper flushed slightly, and Sonic flickered in and out of existence slightly more than usual. "It doesn't?" Sonic finally asked. "Obviously. What do I care about the machinations of politicians or the movement of fleets? Aurora might care about the political maneuvering, granted, and I'm certain 26 would be overjoyed to see more ships, but personally, I don't see why I would care except that they do." Ivil shrugged languidly. "Now, tell me of the dating scene on this station." "The dating scene?" Pepper asked. "Yes," Ivil said. "I need to invite Aurora on a pleasant first date. I don't know what to aim for, however. What would a woman like her truly enjoy? As for 26, I fear that our first date was a terrible mistake on my part. A fancy restaurant." She shook her head. "What a blunder. Why would 26 care for such things?" Sonic was quick to recuperate from the shift in subjects. Perhaps that same restaurant would be more favorable for Miss Sterlingworth. She might appreciate the higher-class dining experience in a way that Miss 26 isn't equipped for. Pepper nodded. "I've spoken a little with 26. I do think that a nice restaurant was a miss. Have you considered something more like a museum for her? She likes technology, and I'm certain she'd be interested in history. Are there any good museums on Driftwood Station? Ivil asked. No, I'm afraid not. There's a small one that tracks the station's history, but it's small, underfunded, and not highly rated, Pepper said. Maybe something else, then. Would she be interested in a more physical date? Sonic asked. Pepper blinked. Sex? No, Sonic replied. I meant a gym outing, or sports. Oh, Pepper replied. Her cheeks flushed. Yes, that could be interesting. Oh. There's an arcade in one of the stations on the far end of Driftwood. It's a rather popular dating site for younger couples. It's not exactly physical, but it's active, loud, there's cheap food and small prizes. I'm afraid that it's mostly a way to scam tourists out of their money, but it could be an interesting venue for a date. An arcade. Yes, I suppose that would be somewhat fitting. Pepper. Yes, ma'am. Pepper said as she jumped to attention. Ensure that the gifts at this arcade are up to standard. Nothing exaggerated, of course. And perhaps we can have the venue scouted for any trouble that might show up around it. I won't have this date interrupted by some idiots with small brains and no common sense. Yes, we can do that, Pepper said. It's actually kind of sweet of you. Ivil refused to react to that. Now, the date with Aurora. That will be somewhat more difficult. I think Aurora is someone somewhat harder to please. She has all she needs already, Sonic replied. Is a nice meal at an upscale dining establishment not enough? Don't be silly, of course it's not enough, Ivil said. She started to pace the room but quickly discovered that it wasn't nearly large enough to pace. So as she walked, she pushed space out ahead of her, enlarging the room with every step while maintaining the exterior dimensions. She will be more difficult to please, Pepper said. Not that it's necessarily a bad thing, her standards are just higher than most. Ivil hummed and continued pacing. Min has a list of the suitors her parents picked out for her. Ivil stopped mid-step. Pardon me? She asked. Pepper blinked, seeming surprised to have Ivil's full attention. Did you not read Miss Sterlingworth's brief? No, I did not. I didn't want to sully the mental image I had of her by discovering what Mint could find from her past, Ivil said. Oh. Well, she has a few suitors picked out by her family. Marriage prospects. Why was I not informed about this? Ivil said. It was in the brief? Pepper tried. Ivil glared, but, well, that was a fair point. Does Aurora know about them? I believe so. Her departure from Phobos was timed to avoid meeting one, Pepper said. Mint psychoanalysis suggests that part of the reason she took on this mission of hers was to avoid being, betrothed to certain people that she found unfavorable. Ivil stewed. This put a whole new spin on all sorts of things. Now she didn't just need to win Aurora over, she had to prove that she was better than these unknown suitors. But then, that might prove to be an opportunity. Chapter 79, Problem Solving. Sometimes, on rare occasions, problems solve themselves. There was a knock at Ivil's door. 3 taps, evenly spaced, loud enough to be heard clearly without being so loud as to insult. There was only one person that knock could belong to. Come in, Ivil said. The door opened, and Aurora slipped into the captain's cabin. She was dressed rather plainly, her hair wrapped in a towel with slippers on. Evelyn, she said. Ivil felt her eyebrows rising as she took the woman in. Aurora was rarely not dressed her best, though it was clear the woman had just left the shower. Aurora. To what do I owe the pleasure? Aurora frowned slightly and seemed surprisingly unconcerned about her manner of dress. Evelyn. Do you know how to dance? I do, Ivil replied. That isn't the line of questioning I expected to hear just now. Is anything wrong? Aurora took a deep breath, then nodded. I need a guest to accompany me to a small gathering in one of the nearby ships. There will be food provided, of course, but it's expected that those who attend be able to dance. Not necessarily well, but at least without embarrassing themselves. Ivil perked up. Was Was this Aurora asking her out on a date? What sort of event is this? I wouldn't call it a ball, but it's not so dissimilar to one, Aurora said. Just a small dance organized by some Jovian elites that will be taking place on a pleasure yacht attached to Driftwood. There are a few people there that I would do well to impress. Going all on my own is an option, of course. Nonsense, Ivil said. I'll accompany you, of course. Aurora perked up a little. Thank you. I would invite 26, but, well, I don't think she knows how to dance, or comport herself in that kind of event. Missy is another option, but I question her allegiances. So I'm the safe option? Ivil asked. Aurora flushed faintly. I wouldn't exactly put it that way. But yes? Ivil smiled. This was perhaps the first time anyone had ever referred to her as the safe anything. It was an interesting feeling. What's the dress code? Formal. I suppose you might fit into one of my dresses? If we modify it a lot. Or we can buy something off of a rack if we hurry. No need, Ivil said. I can take care of things myself. When is this event? Aurora glanced at her watch, which wasn't a good sign. In approximately 2 hours. Oh my, cutting it very close, aren't we? It came up unexpectedly, Aurora admitted. Ivil shrugged. She could see what this was under the surface. Or at least, she desperately hoped she was understanding the underlying implication that Aurora merely wanted to go out and dance with her. Go get changed, she said. I'll change myself. Do you have anything appropriate? Aurora asked. Don't you worry about it. Aurora did seem to worry a little, but she nodded, then slipped out of the room. Ivil sensed her heading to the back of the ship towards her own room to get changed. She snapped her attention back, closed the door, then gestured towards her still unused bed. A large briefcase appeared upon it, the latches holding it closed snapping open with a stray thought to reveal Ivil's uniform. It wasn't merely Ivil's uniform in the sense that it was hers, though this was also the uniform that people recognized her for. Darker than blackness itself, cut in the same style as the Martian Navy's top brass, but with a little more flair to it. She'd been inspired by ancient Earth navies when she crafted this uniform. The epaulettes, the high-waisted pants and long flaring jacket. In a blink, she was divested of her archaeologist's costume. In another, she was wearing her uniform once more. It was surprisingly right on her. Familiar after years of being worn. But that had to change. Stepping out dressed as Ivil Antagonist, Empress of Mars would give her away far, far too easily. She summoned a large block of silver and held it floating before her. The side warped and then stilled, becoming a near-perfect mirror that stretched from floor to ceiling. Ivil stood before her reflection and nodded. First, lightening the extremely dark material to something more like a charcoal black. Then a blouse. Pearl white and buttoned up to her neck. A vest over it, then pants that flared a little at the bottom. She sighed and removed her navy boots before summoning a pair of rather lethal heels. A tie. No, too formal. She dismissed it. A bow tie. Goodness no. She wasn't some frumpy nerd. So no tie, then. She popped the button on her collar off and freed her neck some. A hint of clavicle wouldn't hurt. Half turning, she tightened the seat of her pants. Then did it some more. Ivil was under the opinion that she had a fine ass, and she suspected that Aurora would appreciate it. She ran a hand through her hair, making sure it fell properly, then nodded to herself as she adjusted the cuffs of her coat. Aurora was stepping out of her rooms now, and so Ivil dismissed the mirror, made her briefcase fold itself back to nothing, and walked over to the door. She opened it and stepped out, coming face to face with Aurora. The Phobian princess-turned-diplomat was in a light, beige dress. A long skirt that clung to her legs, a plunging neckline that revealed a lot of dark flesh, and a careful application of makeup that drew Ivil's eyes to her lips and eyes. Evelyn, Aurora said as she scanned her up and down. Ah. You clean up well. Why thank you, Ivil said. You look. She paused. Would saying delectable be inappropriate? She decided that she didn't care. Positively delectable. Flattery will get you somewhere, Evelyn, Aurora said. But not right now. Where did you even get that? It's custom tailored, Ivil replied. And I had it with me this entire time. You never know when you'll have the opportunity to dress to impress. Aurora replied. She was still eyeing Ivil up and down. Ivil didn't preen under the gaze, because that would be immature, but she did make a point of slowly turning to close her door behind her so that Aurora would get a good view. Shall we? She asked once everything was shut. Aurora wasn't meeting her eye as she nodded. Certainly, she replied. Ivil smiled. She hadn't felt this smug in a while, but she felt like she deserved it. She was getting a good grade in lesbian, something that was both normal to want and possible to achieve. Aurora led her out of the SFO and Ivil noticed that even though the docks were rather sparsely populated, they were still grabbing some attention from the few people around. She supposed that they did stand out from the crowd. The average citizen of Driftwood Station didn't dress in anything approaching formal wear. So, what can you tell me about this ball? Ivil asked. It's a relatively minor event, Aurora said. I only received an invitation because it's being held by an affiliate of one of the Jovian diplomats that we met at that last conference. I suspect he sent invitations to everyone nearby. I would ordinarily have avoided the entire thing, but it may well be a good opportunity to make better contacts. Are you so concerned about the upcoming conference? Ivil asked. Yes. The fate of Phobos may well rely on it. Though I'm proud of what I've achieved so far. I've gained Phobos a solid number of cores, assuming all goes well. And that's important to you, Ivil said. It wasn't quite a question. Aurora took a moment before nodding. It is. Why? Ivil asked simply. Aurora glanced up at her, then back out ahead. It's important for me to establish myself. That's all. If I come back from this diplomatic mission having succeeded better than anyone expected, then I'm more likely to be chosen for the next. That's the start of a career, one that might carry a lot of weight. Ah, so you intend to make a career of this? Ivil asked. She supposed that was important to know before moving forwards. 26 obviously wanted a career of sorts in mechanics, something Ivil could easily provide. Breaking things was easy. But a career in politics? Well, Ivil supposed she might have dabbled a little. I do, Aurora said. And what does your family think of that? Ivil asked. Aurora stiffened. She was quiet for a few long steps. What do you know? She asked. Pardon? Your line of questioning is suspiciously leading, Missville. I don't believe it to be entirely natural. You know, or suspect something. Ivil shrugged. I've recently discovered that you have a number of suitors, which suggests some meddling on your family's part. I feel like that knowledge might explain why you're here, so far from home, bravely placing yourself in harm's way to make something of yourself. Aurora stopped walking so suddenly that Ivil almost took a step before she noticed. This may have been a bad idea, she said. Chapter 80, The Flavor of Failure. What do you mean? Ivil asked. She wasn't unfamiliar with failure, but it had been some time since it had last flavored her life. Aurora glanced around them. They were in one of the wider corridors linking several stations together. There were some ducks nearby, and Ivil had been under the impression they were heading that way before Aurora had stopped. This not a date we're going on, Aurora said as she gestured between the two of them. It's a farce. How is it a farce? Ivil asked. I am not pretending to be interested in you. Aurora scoffed. As blunt as always, Missville, she said. But no, that's not what I meant. It's not you who is an issue, it's me. Is this a rejection? Ivil asked. Yes. No, Ivil said. I'm not sure I want to be rejected. Aurora crossed her arms. I don't think that's how it works. Sure it is, Ivil said. Why am I being rejected, exactly? I told you, it's me, not you. She gestured vaguely in Ivil's direction with a hand. You have been very good. Strange, yes, but frank and honest. I would be lucky to find a partner like yourself. I'm certain that 26 will be a very happy girl. You still haven't explained yourself, Ivil said. I don't want to, she replied. Ivil considered that for a moment. On the one hand, she couldn't force Aurora. Not without harming her and their relationship. On the other hand, I don't accept that answer, Ivil said slowly, each word measured. You're being far less romantic when you're so pushy, Aurora warned. And yet you've decided that romance is over. A choice that I categorically disagree with. Hence, I'd appreciate it if you could explain. What did I do wrong? What can I do to fix things? Please? Aurora eyed her for just a moment, but her gaze never met Ivil's. I said. It's not you, Evelyn, it's me. Or my family, I suppose. Then I'll get rid of them, Ivil said. Aurora shook her head. Don't be that way. This isn't a problem you can solve with violence. Ivil was tempted to be glib and say that there were few problems that couldn't be solved with violence, but she chose not to be so dismissive. Aurora was genuinely concerned, and that deserved a genuine reply. I'm sorry. You might be right. But truly, communicate with me. Please? Aurora might have felt her honesty, or maybe she just wanted to tell Ivil to begin with and just needed a push. In either case, she nodded, then looked around them. They were gathering some attention, more for having stopped in a corridor with no signs that they intended to move. Come, let's. There's a cafe over there. Ivil followed. The cafe was a small space, entirely unworthy of note. Just a rest stop for commuters with a young man behind the counter looking like he despised his work and a small line of people waiting for their drinks. They weren't bothered as they took some seats near the back, next to a row of vending machines. It was cramped and the space smelled like artificial sweeteners and grease, but they sat across from each other anyway. Aurora was quiet for a while, then she spoke. I want to be angry at you, you know? But we had these courses on Phobos, for the young nobility. I think half the kids there slept through them, but I loved those classes. They were on psychology. Ivil nodded. Anyway, they mentioned that when you do something to harm someone, there's a defense mechanism that can activate in your mind. A trick of the brain. It looks for reasons to make it so that you can blame the other for your own faults. It's something we were told to watch out for in our subordinates, because that might cause them to report things incorrectly. We were never taught to apply that reasoning to ourselves. Aurora locked her lips and finally met Ivil's eyes. I want to blame you for my problems, Evelyn, even if I know it's not right. I don't mind, not that much, Ivil said. Maybe that makes you a better person than me. I very truly doubt that, Ivil replied. She carefully reached across the table and wrapped a hand over Aurora's. What is it? Aurora looked at their hands for a moment before replying. I'm not on this diplomatic mission because my parents want me to be. In fact, my family is very much opposed to it. The Sterlingworth family is on a decline and has been for some time. My uncle, the heir, is a fop. He wasted away a lot of the money and prestige that my grandparents earned. My own parents are better, but not by too much. I think I've heard us referred to as the three-generation problem. I'm familiar, Ivil said. It was part of an old proverb. The first generation of a family would make the wealth, the second would spend it, and the third would see none of it. In this case, Aurora was that third generation. Well, a solution to that problem is tying the Sterlingworths to another family or two. I have a cousin who did just that. She married into one of the other noble families around Phobos. Happily? Ivil asked. Killed herself a year later. Ah. Aurora shrugged. I don't want that for myself. So when I saw an opportunity, I took it. If I establish myself as a valuable diplomat for Phobos, then I'm set. That was my thinking. It seems reasonable. It's not. It's stupid, wishful thinking. No matter how valuable I am as a diplomat, that value is personal. It's not tied back to the family except tangentially. It won't be enough to escape the constant push to be married. Worse, if the family decides that my constant refusal is too much and they cut ties, then I'm screwed, for lack of a better term. And this prevents us from being a thing. How? because even if I do find your company quite enjoyable, and your brute charm somewhat endearing, you aren't a Phobian noble. My family wouldn't accept this. There's no political value in being with you, so it would be wasted. Ivil blinked. Well, there was one simple solution to this. Aurora. There is not a single person around Mars that has more political strength than I do. So please, let's go to this dance where you can amaze some fools with your wit and I'll amaze them by having you on my arm, and then we can continue and see where this all takes us. Aurora smiled slightly. You're strong, I'll grant you that, and maybe that would be enough, but personal strength isn't everything. It's a lot though, especially when you reach the top. Aurora sifted. I suppose one dance couldn't hurt. Such a simple sentence shouldn't have been enough to light a supernova in Ivil's chest, but it was, and that burning star only grew brighter when Aurora spared her a smile. It was one part sad, but many more parts hopeful. She stood, then extended a hand to Aurora, who took it. They both casually ignored the wage slave who reminded them that they couldn't use the cafe without paying for something as they walked out towards the docking bay across the station. Aurora seemed determined not to talk about anything important as they found their way to a well-guarded dock leading to a pleasure yacht. A scan by some guards and they were let into the yacht. It was large, even by the standards of Phobian nobility, with elegant curves and wide windows affording a view of Callisto below and the stars beyond. No more running, Ivil said once they were done with the pleasantries of meeting the busybodies that lingered by the entrance. One dance. One dance, Aurora agreed. There were already a few sparse couples occupying the ballroom floor. Ivil placed a hand on Aurora's waist, gently, but firmly, holding her close. For a moment, they just stood there, but then Aurora placed a hand on Ivil's shoulder, and took the first step. Ivil smiled, and with a small push from Aurora, they began to move. Slowly at first, both unsure, but gradually their steps fell into a rhythm. The world outside spun gently, stars slipping by and strangers staring, but none of it mattered. Aurora rested her head against Ivil's shoulder, and Ivil's breath was filled with the scent of her perfume. She found herself not speechless, but unwilling to speak. For now, nothing truly needed to be said.